I've spent 5 decades studying madness on screen, but nothing prepared me for Tuesday night. You know what? In my career, I've become an expert at recognizing when someone's losing their grip on reality. Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, spiraling into his own twisted world. Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull, consumed by rage he couldn't control. These weren't just roles for me, they were psychological deep dives into the human mind when it starts to fracture. But what I witnessed Tuesday night during that national address, and that wasn't acting, that was the real thing, happening live in the Oval Office. Picture this scene. You're expecting presidential leadership. Instead, you get a man who looks like he hasn't slept in days, hair disheveled, tie askew, eyes darting around the room like he's seeing threats that aren't there. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know this look. I've worn it on screen dozens of times. The first warning sign, he abandoned the teleprompter. Every president uses one during national addresses. It's not optional, it's essential. But this guy, he was completely off script. And when you're addressing 330 million Americans during a crisis, improvisation becomes incredibly dangerous. Within minutes, I watched him spiral exactly like Travis Bickle in that mirror scene. You talking to me? But this time, it was, the media's lying about me. Same paranoid delusions, same detachment from reality, except this wasn't fiction. This was the commander-in-chief having a complete psychological breakdown on the world's biggest stage. Here's what really terrified me as someone who's studied unhinged characters. He started interrupting himself mid-sentence, just like Jake LaMotta when the rage took over and he couldn't complete a coherent thought. Economy, then immigration, then his legal troubles, back to the economy, but completely different numbers, then some conspiracy about vote counting. His mind was jumping between topics like a pinball machine, and you could see him losing the thread of his own thoughts. But the scariest part, the lies weren't strategic political spin. They were complete fabrications, numbers that were backwards from reality, statistics he was clearly inventing on the spot. At one point, he claimed crime rates had dropped 90% in cities that actually saw increases. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so divorced from reality that it reminded me of Rupert Pupkin in The King of Comedy. A man so convinced of his own fantasy that truth became irrelevant. What kept me awake that night was recognizing the pattern. In Taxi Driver, Travis gradually loses touch with reality until he can't distinguish between his delusions and the real world. Tuesday night, I watched that exact progression, except this time it was happening to the person with access to nuclear weapons. You could feel the panic in the room. I've been on movie sets when everything goes wrong, but this was different. This wasn't a scene that could be reshot. This was live television, broadcast globally, and there was no director to yell, "Cut." I could sense his staff's terror even though they weren't visible. They knew they were witnessing something unprecedented and catastrophic. 20 minutes in, he started naming specific reporters, politicians, judges, settling personal scores during what was supposed to be a national address. It was like watching someone use the most sacred platform in American democracy as their personal Twitter feed, except the whole world was watching. Our allies, our enemies, everyone seeing the leader of the free world completely lose his composure. I kept thinking about the characters I've played and their breaking points. Travis Bickle's violence was contained to fiction. Jake LaMotta's rage destroyed his personal relationships but didn't threaten national security. But this breakdown, this was happening in the Oval Office, and the implications were terrifying. The voice cracking wasn't from emotion or passion for the country. It was pure rage, the kind I've portrayed in dozens of films but never wanted to see in real life, especially not from a president. You could see the veins in his neck bulging, his face reddening, hands gesturing wildly like he was conducting some angry orchestra only he could hear. Within hours of that speech ending, foreign leaders were making frantic calls. The British Prime Minister had to reassure Parliament that America was still a reliable ally. Even our enemies were trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. What are they thinking? They're thinking America is vulnerable, that the guy supposed to lead the free world can't even lead himself through a basic speech. The damage control started immediately. Statements flying out, trying to clarify what he meant, walking back the worst part, spinning this train wreck into something coherent. But you can't unring that bell. You can't take back what the world witnessed. And even his own party, Republicans who've defended him through everything, struggle to explain this one away. Here's what really gets me angry as someone who's spent my career exploring the human condition. There are real problems facing this country, real challenges that need real leadership, people struggling, families hurting, communities divided. Instead of addressing any of that, instead of rising to the moment, we got 25 minutes of self-pity and conspiracy theories broadcast to the world. This wasn't just a bad speech or an embarrassing moment we can laugh about later. This was a warning, a preview of what happens when someone fundamentally unfit for leadership gets the ultimate leadership position. In my films, when characters like Travis Bickle or Jake LaMotta lose control, there are consequences. The difference is those consequences were contained to the screen. But when the President of the United States has that same kind of breakdown, the consequences affect everyone. If he can't handle the pressure of giving a speech, how is he going to handle a real crisis? A terrorist attack, a natural disaster, a nuclear threat? The answer became crystal clear that night. He won't. He'll fall apart just like he did on live television. I've lived through many presidents, good and bad. I've seen incompetence, scandal, failure. But I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen a president so fundamentally disconnected from the responsibilities of leadership, so completely unable to rise to the moment when everything depended on steady leadership. What we witnessed wasn't passion or fighting for the people, it was a complete mental breakdown, and pretending otherwise doesn't make it less dangerous. Democracy isn't guaranteed, and what happened Tuesday night was democracy in crisis, broadcast live for the world to see. But here's what nobody's talking about: the panic behind closed doors after that speech. I've been on enough film sets to recognize crisis mode, and you could practically smell the fear through the screen. Staff members were probably crying, not from sadness, but pure terror. They knew they'd witnessed something that could fundamentally damage America's standing on the world stage. You want to know what really haunts me? I grew up in New York in the 1940s and 50s, watching my neighbors argue about politics over dinner. Sure, they'd get heated, but they still respected the office of the presidency. They understood that when someone speaks from behind that desk, they're representing something bigger than themselves. What we saw Tuesday night was the complete opposite of that dignity. I keep thinking about the specific moment when his voice started cracking. Not from emotion, but from rage consuming him completely. It reminded me of preparing for Jake LaMotta's breakdown scenes in Raging Bull. I spent months studying how anger can literally change someone's voice, their posture, their entire presence. But that was for a character study. This was real life, and the rage was coming from the man with his finger on the nuclear button. The international implications hit me like a freight train. I've traveled the world promoting films, met with foreign dignitaries, seen how America is viewed abroad. We used to be the steady hand, the reliable partner. Now, foreign intelligence agencies are probably writing reports about our president's mental state, analyzing his speech patterns for signs of instability. That's not politics, that's national security. What scared me most was recognizing the progression I've seen in method acting when someone goes too deep into a disturbed character. First comes the paranoia, seeing enemies everywhere. Then the rage, lashing out at anyone nearby. Finally, complete detachment from reality where the performance becomes the person. Except this wasn't a performance, and there was no director to pull him back to reality. I started thinking about other presidents I've lived through. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, steady as granite when the world was 13 days from nuclear war. Reagan after the Challenger explosion, finding exactly the right words to help a nation grieve. Obama after Sandy Hook, showing genuine compassion in unimaginable circumstances. They all understood that the presidency demands you become bigger than yourself, that personal grievances disappear when you're speaking for America. Tuesday night was the opposite of everything the office represents. Instead of rising to meet the moment, we watched someone shrink into their worst impulses on live television. And the most chilling part, his supporters will probably defend this breakdown, call it passion or authenticity. But anyone who's studied human behavior, anyone who's portrayed unstable characters could see this wasn't passion. This was a man losing his grip on reality in real time. The aftermath tells the real story. Within 12 hours, the dollar had fluctuated, our allies were privately expressing concern, and even some Republicans were quietly distancing themselves from the speech. That's not normal political fallout. That's what happens when the world loses confidence in American leadership. But here's what really got to me personally. My phone started ringing within minutes of that speech ending. Fellow actors, directors, people I've worked with for decades, all asking the same question. Did you see what we just saw? These aren't political people. They're artists, storytellers, people who understand human psychology, and they were all genuinely frightened. One director I've known for 30 years said something I can't get out of my head. Bobby, I've seen you play crazy better than anyone, but that wasn't acting. That was real madness, and it's in the White House. The question now isn't whether we can recover from this embarrassment. It's whether we're willing to admit what we saw was unacceptable and whether we're prepared to demand leaders who can actually lead. Because if there's one thing my career has taught me about playing unhinged characters, it's that the breakdown is never the end of the story. It's always the beginning of something much worse.